Hey, Grill fam, it's Jaron Keith Gaynor, White House correspondent and managing editor of politics at TheGrio, and I'm here with 2024 presidential candidate Marianne Williamson. Ms. Williamson, welcome to TheGrio. Pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So 4 years ago, you launched your campaign for president seeking the Democratic nomination in 2020. Ultimately, you dropped out of the race before the primary elections. What made you decide to put your name back in the race for the 2024 presidential election? What's different this time?
Well, obviously, the country's in a very different place. I think all of us are. I think running for president is something that is a deep gut call. You don't do it unless every part of you says, this is what I am supposed to do with my life. It's not an easy thing to do. It's somewhat brutal. It's exhilarating and it's brutal. I believe that many of the things that I talked about 4 years ago, the problems that I addressed, are even more true today. I think that people are more open today to a conversation that I'm having, including at this time, the possibility of an actual economic U-turn in this country. We live in a society which is economically unjust for the majority of people. We have had over the last 48 years a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the 1% of people. So what the president's agenda says is, look, life's tough and I'll help you survive it. I'll help ameliorate the stress of living in a situation where 60% of people, for instance, are living paycheck to paycheck. My agenda is something that I think people realize is reasonable. Why don't we just end the injustice? Why don't the American people get what the average citizen of every other advanced democracy gets? They get universal health care. They get tuition-free college and university, which we had until the 1960s. They get free childcare. They get a guaranteed livable wage. They get family and sick pay. So Americans are waking up, and I think that there's a listening to what I'm saying. That first of all, I think there's a listening to me, but more importantly, it needs to be said. And that is an agenda that needs to be effectuated. I'm a Democrat. I think that it's the only agenda that's going to beat back the Republicans in 2024. But more importantly, I think it's the agenda that's going to repair this country.
Obviously, no sitting president wants to be primaried. And I can imagine that the administration and Democratic leadership are not necessarily happy about your campaign for president. There are also critics who have called you a fringe candidate who has a long shot path to the Oval Office. What is your response to critics? Okay,
so I grew up at a time when Eugene McCarthy primaried LBJ, Bobby Kennedy primaried LBJ. Nobody even thought about saying you can't or you shouldn't. It's called a democracy, and people, Democratic voters and the American people, should hear as many voices with as many ideas, particularly at a time like this. People should hear as many options as are out there. This should not be a decision made by a bunch of men sitting around a table smoking cigars, deciding who the nominee should be like 100 years ago. No sitting president wants it. Well, hey, there are a lot of things they don't want. This isn't a democracy where people run. As far as me being a long shot is concerned, I think that's exactly what we said about Donald Trump. And for that matter, Barack Obama was considered a long shot when he first ran. Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in, remember? So they say things like this because they'll say whatever it takes to peripheralize a candidacy which is inconvenient to them.
I remember in your last campaign for president, you talking about the ways in which hate has been harnessed in America's politics, and how there is opportunity for love to be harnessed in a different way in American politics. Do you find that when talking about things like love, and given your background as a author about spirituality, that it's almost a dirty word in politics?
Well, there is not just a Democratic, a political elite to whom the conversation sounds airy-fairy or silly, unless it's someone like a Cory Booker who mentions it, or, some male minister mentions it. Then they say, oh, yes, sir, that sounds great. So that's just an inconvenience for them that I bring up something more expansive than their political dialogue, which actually is sort of based in 1984. I can tell you this, when I'm talking to voters, they don't think it's ridiculous. The voters in this country realize, and the very people that you mentioned actually realize as well, we have a problem on our hands. Hatred in all its most virulent forms, white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, these ancient malevolent forces of mind have been harnessed in our time as they have been harnessed before for political purposes, and they are shouting. And at a time when hate is shouting, love cannot afford to whisper. We need to harness what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. We need to harness love of justice, love of democracy, love of one another, love of the earth. So absolutely, we need to harness the counterforce to all that hatred that's out there. We need to harness it for political purposes. And the people that I talk to who are actual voters don't think that that's a joke whatsoever.
President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their administration has been touted by many in the Democratic Party for passing some of the most landmark legislation since FDR and Lyndon B. Johnson, from the bipartisan infrastructure law to the Inflation Reduction Act, and even some of the federal investments from the American Rescue Plan. How would you assess the job performance of the Biden-Harris administration, and why do you believe that you can do a better job?
Well, the president defeated Trump, and for that, we owe him a debt of gratitude. The president has taken incremental approaches, as I mentioned before, which have ameliorated some of the stress that people are living with. But people still do not have universal health care. He has said that he would cancel, he would veto a Medicare for all bill. He promised that we would be raising the minimum wage, and when it went beyond federal workers, once it hit the no from the parliamentarian, who actually has no political authority, they just left it at that. They halved the child poverty rate in this country with the child tax credit. But then when that expired, they did not bother to permanentize it. The president said that he has recognized that the existential threat posed by climate change, but he's actually given more drilling permits even than Trump did. And now he has okayed the Willow Project, which is an $8 billion project of fossil fuel extraction in the North Slope of Alaska that will have catastrophic environmental consequences. The president, once again, what he has done, some of which is to be commended, is not this radical FDR type stuff that the PR, the PR that they come up with in PR tanks, think tanks in Washington. The president is taking an incremental approach. He himself had said nothing would fundamentally change. So when the president and those who say the lines that you said before say that we should be so happy because the economy is doing well, it's doing well for 20% of Americans, and that is not enough to win the race. So 20% of Americans are doing fine in the United States, but living on a kind of economic enchanted island that is surrounded by a sea of economic despair. Now, to go into the 2024 race with a message that the economy is doing well, when it's only doing well for 20% of the people, to even say that things are doing well is so contrary to the visceral experience of the majority of Americans. And it won't work in 2024. In 2024, we need to say to the American people, and I am the one who would say that, you deserve an economic U-turn. You deserve what the citizens in every other advanced democracy have. You deserve universal health care. You deserve tuition-free college. You deserve those college loans simply eradicated. You deserve free child care. You deserve family leave, sick pay, and a guaranteed living wage. That is where money comes from. Help people thrive. Don't just help people survive, which is what the president's agenda does. And I think he does it with good intention. We need to help people thrive. I think we need to be very clear what we're facing here. We are facing a neo-fascist authoritarian threat. But FDR said that we would not have to worry about a fascist threat as long as democracy delivered on its promises. Democracy is not delivering on its promises. For the richest country in the world not to have universal health care, for the richest country in the world not to have paid family leave, for the richest country in the world not to have tuition-free colleges, and for one reason only, because we have a corporate aristocracy where the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies, the big food companies, the big chemical companies, the big agricultural companies, the gun manufacturers, big oil and defense contractors actors own this country. And when you ask me what was different between now and 4 years ago, I think it's how many people have awakened on the left and on the right to the fact that we have basically a form of corporate tyranny in this country. The government should be protecting the people, not enabling these big corporate monopolies the way they are. The president pushes back a little. I would push back a lot.